Okay, back. Um, so where we left off before I broke the video was we were looking at the differences in the server file. So let's ignore this top part for a second. I'm going to scroll down. We'll talk about all that in a bit. We're going to look at this bottom section here. Okay, so one thing you'll notice here is before we would just, on the left side, we would just app listen on a port when, to start up our web server. And right now, we actually need to do something a little different because we need to support HTTPS. And the way this reads is I'm using a new environment variable called localhost. I mean, there's lots of ways of doing this, but I just create a new local environment called localhost. And when that environment variable exists, I am going to actually serve up HTTPS from the app itself, right? And this is basically the way you do it. You use this HTTPS, which comes from, I believe, it's actually part of the node environment, right? HTTPS. And so I didn't have to import a library for it. Then I created the server. I used two files, a server key and a server cert, right? And we'll talk about how to make those in a minute. And then I just pass it the app, right? And then I listen on the port like I did before. So I'm using a condition based on an environment variable to serve up HTTPS as the environment variable exists. Otherwise, I just do the normal HTTP. And if you remember right, Heroku, the way Heroku works is you just serve up HTTP and then the HTTPS wrapper is provided by Heroku itself. Okay, so the key here is how do we create these files, right? So let me switch gears and back to the command line. Let's see, I can't remember the command offhand, so let's see, not git, history, grep open SSL. Okay, so here's the command. I'm not going to run it right now because I already ran it. But again, this will work on Unix machines or a Mac, right? And you can Google this for your platform too. You just Google self-signed SSL, right? And then you'll end up with basically these instructions. But the command is, in this case on a Mac, it's open SSL, and I don't know all the parameters, but I do know that some nodes is important. That means you're not encrypting your keys, right? So basically in your output key file and a server cert file, and that's basically, and you store those in this same along with your project. So that's why you'll see those files sitting here, and you add this code, and now you've got SSL locally. And that's going to be important because the callback that Salesforce needs has to be HTTPS. Okay, so that's HTTPS. Oh, the only kind of related to this was, I mentioned it, but there's an environment file which you can't see here. Actually, you can see, just not in that view. So let me switch to the files. I did mention that, so in the environment file, ignore all the other ones, entries. I have more entries than before, but I added a new one, localhost true. So when I'm on the local version of environment, I'm going to set localhost to true. When it's in Heroku, I will not have that flag on, right? And that way, that's what's triggering the HTTPS. Okay, that's entirety of that. Another thing I did was I'm starting to find out that I started having a lot of environment variables, especially for the Salesforce. And so it used to be that all my environment code was all littered, like reading out of the environment variables and validating it. It was all over the place in the code. So just for convenience, I split that out into a separate file, a new file. So basically, and there are more sophisticated ways of validating your environment variables, but this is a kind of a simple button, right? So what I'm doing here is this file is exporting out a bunch of variables, right? Which all it's doing is it's reading all the environment variables out of the environment, right? And then I'm just doing a quick check to make sure that they're all defined. If they're not defined, I just exit the app. Right? That makes sure that your app won't have some subtle bug with some missing environment variable that's required, right? So the idea is just pull out all my environment checking into a separate file. So that was one general pattern. I just pulled all that code out of the one. Another thing I did was I actually pulled out and I created another file called Redis. What I found out was is that two things. One was I had my server code was getting a little bit bloated, and because and one of the things that was taking up a lot of space was my sort of my promise wrapper for Redis, and so I said, and I need to pull that out. It was just cluttering up the server code. It was kind of very different than the server code. And then two was when I wrote the original version of the Redis code, I was only using it for storing the tokens, right, the auth tokens in an earlier video, and it was very specific to that use case. So this time I changed it a bit. I generalized Redis code with it used to say set token and get token, I think it was, or check token. Now it's basically the same code, except for now I'm actually passing, one's called set value and one is get value. And this time I'm passing a key value pair, right? And then I get the value back with a key. So it's kind of a getter or a setter. I do add this extra expiration date time in seconds as an option. It turns out I'm not going to use that on this video, but I might use it later. That's a common parameter when you're setting up your Redis tokens or Redis keys. You can set them to expire after so many seconds automatically, so you don't have to manage it. So again, this was just generalizing the Redis code, and then you can see the other half of this is if you go to the server code, you can see I removed all the Redis code out. So if you look down right about in here, you can see this whole section got changed because I pulled out all the Redis code out. So that's why it's that big red block there. And then you can see that there were sprinklings of changes. So it used to be set token. Now I'm using set value where I pass in the key. Right? So it's right. And then you can see here I used to do a check token. Now I'm doing a get value against the token prefix, and then I check to see if it's null. So it's just changing up that a bit of code. So that's all that. I mean, in fact, if you look at this file, that's almost all of the changes to this file. Right? Let me make sure. Oh, right. Okay, so there's actually one more line that got added in here. You'll see I have this app use OAuth 2. That's the only other change in this file, and I import it at the top here. Right. So we'll talk about that shortly. Okay. So let's change gears. One of the change I made. Yeah. So this was, and again, this was kind of a punt. But if I look at my package JSON, I used to run a command called npm run watch, which would basically, concurrently was a library that let me run two processes and then have its output combined together in a single screen. And so I'd basically run two other commands. I'd run watch ts and watch node. It was just a convenience method, right, to not have to run two different commands in two different command line windows. But I started finding that this concurrently running with these two commands, I was getting in some sort of loop where when I would compile a file, it would update, and then that would then trigger node reload, but it would happen like in a loop, right? Or not loop, but it would happen lots of times, and then the whole process would basically not load the application. So instead of troubleshooting it any harder, I decided it wasn't worth my time, so I just pulled out the watch command. And when we run our app, we'll have to run it in two command line windows, and you'll see me do that. And then as such, for cleanliness, I just removed the concurrently library here because I'm not using it anymore. So that's why that changes there. And we'll see how that's used. So the next thing we did was, just so you know, the only new library we introduce here is a library called JSForce. It is a kind of a client library for interacting with Salesforce APIs. I believe that if you look at the Salesforce docs on REST, they actually mention two libraries. One is called for Node, one is JSForce, and one is like NSForce or something like that. I don't remember, but the one I'm more familiar with was JSForce, and it seemed to have better documentation, so I went with it, right? And the relevance there is just a lot easier to use this library to do things like the auth piece, to even interacting with the APIs. It's without this library, it's clumsy. The return results don't look like you have to really parse them really hard to get to the data. So this just makes it super convenient for interacting with Salesforce APIs. As a matter of fact, I did this whole video, or I did this whole series without it at first, thinking I didn't need it, and then I realized I had a lot more code than I wanted, and then I switched back to using JS4. So it's highly recommended. Okay, so what we're going to do now is, now that we've had, you would have installed JSForce and the type library for it, let's look to see how we use that library to do our auth and also to interact with APIs directly. So there's another. So I think we've covered most of the files here. The key one next. Okay, I'm just go through the list here. Actually, I noticed one more in here that I caught. So we already talked. Let's start at the top. Package JSON. We talked about the keys. We talked about constants. We have not talked about. So let me talk about that real quickly. So what I also figured out was I started finding myself having a bunch of constants littered. Some was in my server code, some was in my Redis code, some was in my OAuth code. I started getting all tangled up with where all my constants were. So I moved all my constants that I defined in the code all into one spot, in one file, and then I just import them from there. So that's all this file is just centralizing all my constants, right? Default port, Redis, and then my new Salesforce ones. Okay. Environment we already talked about. That is basically centralizing all the environment variables into one file, right? Redis we talked about. That was the changes for just moving that, centralizing that Redis code out of the server file. Server we already looked at. Minimal changes is basically mostly just to accommodate the change in Redis and HTTPS. The ones we haven't looked at are these synchronize and this auth2. So let's look at auth2. That's going to be the first thing we're going to work through. And this one will take a little bit more time to go through. So first of all, actually what I'm going to do, since this is all new, I'm going to make this easier to read by just going into the file itself. So this is auth. Why am I having? Oh, it's source auth. OAuth2. Okay, so let's look through this file. It's not, well, actually, it's not even that long, but okay. So we import stuff at the beginning. Let's not worry about that for a minute. We're importing stuff. Let's look at the actual code. Okay, first thing we need to do, and then this is just straight out of the JSForce docs, right? We're basically setting up some endpoints to help with the OAuth workflow, right? The end result of this section is you actually have two endpoints. One's called auth and one's called callback, right? So so the first thing you do is you create a new auth client, and you have to use, remember the consumer key we had a key and a secret that we pulled out of Salesforce. And you notice that those are now in my environment file. I guess I'm jumping around a little bit, but in my environment file, I had to define my callback URL, right? Where Salesforce is going to call back to, and I had to copy and paste those two, this key and the secret from Salesforce, and I pasted them in here. Okay. Now that I have those, my OAuth is going to use those, right, to kind of create this OAuth2 file, components or clients, whatever it is, right? So this is an express thing. What I'm doing is I'm collapsing. I'm going to have all of these URLs are going to be /OAuth2 /something, right? So this is just an express thing where I can collapse everything out of this file into this sub tree, right? So right now I'm creating a new router, and I say router get /auth. So that's really under the scenes /OAuth2 /auth, right? And all I do is I just call that OAuth2 get authorization URL, and I pass it in the scope. And again, this is just right out of the docs for JSForce. And the key here is I'm adding there's two ones in particular I'm adding, refresh token and offline access. That's going to allow for me to get a refresh token, which will be important for like in a permanent, like kind of a semi-permanent, well, essentially permanent credentials to log into Salesforce. Okay. Again, that depends on your use case. In my use case, I'm using like again, we're going to do like a user that's like an integration user that's going to log in once and we never ever touch it again. And then it will keep those credentials around indefinitely. Okay, so this when the user goes to /auth, then they're going to get redirected to Salesforce to have to log in. When they're done logging in, it's going to call this callback API, right, or endpoint, right? Now, this is just so you know, I've built this whole thing around kind of an API integration, and that didn't do any GUIs or any. So the results of these things tends to send things like authorized true. In reality, the end of this, if this is like a real web app, this would actually be a redirect to restart your app right here. But for now, I'm just doing everything. I don't have a GUI front end of this thing, so I'm just doing everything kind of like sending, basically just dumb results out to the output. Okay, so again, normally your callback is your web browser is coming back and it needs to get to a page that the user can then continue doing their stuff, right? In this case, it's not so relevant because I'm actually doing an integration user. But okay, long story short, a little bit confusing there. Okay, what does callback do? When Salesforce calls it back, you get a code, which is a access code. So that's what this. You're basically reading the access code, and then what you're doing is you're creating a new JS Force connection using the OAuth2 client, right? The fact that I use this any here, by the way, if you don't put any here, then you can't extract out this refresh token. For whatever reason, the type definitions for JS Force are missing the refresh token, and just instead of trying to fix it, or I'm just being lazy, I just punt it and make it any here, and that lets me kind of escape that type. This is basically escaping TypeScript at this point. I'm just using JavaScript. So this connection object is an any object now. Sidebar again. So the way this works is on your callback, you basically call connection authorize, right? And then you have a callback function here. And you basically, out of that, long story short, you get out your access. If it works, you get your access token, an instance URL, and a refresh token. And what I'm doing here is we'll use those when we make our API calls. And you see what I'm doing, all I'm doing is I'm storing them in Redis, right? And then we call the synchronize function, whatever that is. We'll hold off on that for a second. And then we send a response. So the question is, what is the synchronize? Well, that's these other files here. So the general pattern here I'm doing is once you log in, I want to maybe that moment go to Salesforce, hit an API, and pull some data out of it. That's all, right? So let's see what that code looks like. Okay, so this is after you're authorized. I go off and call this synchronize, which is a new file also, this one, okay? And it's not terribly long. Let's just kind of walk through it. So what I'm doing here in the end is going to Salesforce, using my credentials, the various keys, right, or tokens, right? And I'm going to make an API call, get some data back, and that's it. Okay, so when this code runs, it needs to get a copy of all the tokens. So that I read them out of the ones I just saved. I read them out of the Redis, right? And then basically here, if this code gets run for some reason, and we'll talk about that in a bit, without the being logged in, it doesn't crash. It just says, oh, okay, well, I'm not going to do anything, but you're not authorized yet, so I'm just going to abort early. Okay, so assume that you're authorized. I'm making a connection. Again, I pass these parameters. The OAuth2, I pass in all of the client ID, secret, redirect URI, the instance URL, right? All the variables, right? And then, so if you actually, right? So, oh, right. Okay, so let me skip. There's a section here. Let me skip that for 1 second. Once I have the connection, I do. So if you think about the flow here, what's going to happen is when this connection tries to go to Salesforce, and it uses its access token. The access token's lifetime can be, I think the default is 2 hours, so that access token could be invalid. Okay, so what then happens is behind the scenes, this connection client will automatically use your refresh token behind the scenes, go do another API call, get a new access token, right, and then use it for the call. So that way you could just don't have to ever basically handle that yourself. The trick is, though, once you get a new in that scenario, when you got a new access token, there's a callback that you need to store that back in Redis, because that's how your code's working, right? So what I'm doing here is on connection, which is the object, on the refresh, I'm calling handle refresh. And what handle refresh is doing is it is calling, what is it doing here? It, get myself distracted. Oh, handle refresh is, it basically gets it's a function that takes a new fresh token, and you notice it just writes it back into Redis. And then I basically stop listening for refreshes. That's because the synchronized code is really designed to only run once, just so you know. I mean, you may have other code that doesn't do this, and you wouldn't necessarily want to turn off the refresh listener. But in this case, just for cleanliness, the synchronized code, the use case will be, it's going to be used once. You log in, and that's it. It never gets called again. And so that way, just for cleanliness, I'm stopped listening. Okay. Now, okay, so it was a little bit roundabout there. So then finally, now that I got my whole connectional stuff all set up, I actually make my query, which is connection query. Now, there's different ways of interacting with Salesforce. I'm just doing what's called a SOQL, S-O-Q-L. It's like SQL, but the Salesforce version of it. So I'm basically just getting all the IDs and names from contact, right? And I get it back as a response. And normally at this point, this code is designed in theory to like cache that data, right? So this idea is you go off to Salesforce, you get all your contacts, then I might want to cache it, for example, in my database, Postgres database. And that way my Postgres database has a copy of my Salesforce data. And then I can do whatever I want in Postgres. I could have done all that, but I was being lazy, to be honest, and didn't want to get distracted with creating a new migration and all that stuff to create all the table structure for that. So right now I'm just doing a console log of the data just to prove that we can get data from Salesforce. Okay, and that's it. So that was a little bit roundabout, but this and just so you know, we're going to actually. Well, I'll show you. We're going to use the synchronized code in another way. So right now we're using it only when we log in. I synchronize the data once, and then that's it. Okay. There's one other file that's here, and it's under scripts. And let's look at this code. So what I wanted to illustrate is another feature is Heroku has a concept of a cron job that you can run, or cron or scheduler. I think they call it Heroku Scheduler. It's a add-on supplied by Heroku that lets you run scheduled jobs at certain times of the day. So let's say we wanted to synchronize the contacts, some master data, right, every hour on the top of the hour, right? So we need a script to actually run, and that's what the script is. And so we'll walk through setting that up. But the code itself is pretty straightforward. I basically import the synchronize function. The earlier function I had, and I basically call it, which then basically does the API call. It's a one-time shot. Does the API call? It caches it. In this case, this console logs the data, and then I'm done. Right. One of the tricky things about this, though, is thinking about the way that the synchronize works. If you look back at it. It had that callback scenario where it would, if the access token was invalid, it would then use the refresh token to get a new version of the access token, and that happens asynchronously. So I want to be careful here and not necessarily prevent that from happening. So I do a little bit of a kind of a hacky move where when it's done synchronizing the data and gets the data, to make sure that that other call happens and my Redis, I get a new key stored in Redis, I just set a 3-second timeout on this code and say, okay, wait for 3 seconds before you exit to make sure that basically that's plenty of time for that callback to have happened. So that's, if you're wondering why this will hacky timeout set here. And otherwise, so then just exit the code. So this is like a command line tool. You run it, gets the data. Right now console logs it, waits 3 seconds, and then exits. Okay, Whew, a lot of code. Okay, so I think we've actually literally talked about all the code. Okay, so the next thing is, let's just see this all in action, right? So having made all those 11 file changes, right, which we talked about every one of them, let's see if I can actually make this run again. See, get status. Yeah, here we are. Let's do this. Let's do npm run. Oh, okay, right. So I used to do run watch. So now I have to do the two because I got rid of that command. So I have to then, well, npm run watch ts. This is going to basically look for files changing in the TypeScript folder, or in the scripts folder, and compile them every time there's a change. So that's all that command's doing. But that doesn't actually restart the web server. So then I go to cd docs, cd Heroku cert, npm run watch node. And what that's going to do is every time a file changes in the distribution folder, it restarts this process. And so I have the two here. Wait for it to start up. Okay, why isn't it starting up? Oh, there it goes. It's not started yet, for whatever reason. It's funny, sometimes this is quick and sometimes it's not as quick. Okay, now I'm running. Okay, so let's do a little kind of walkthrough of how the code actually works. So I open my web browser. No. Okay, so HTTPS localhost. Let me make this bigger. Okay, so bigger. Okay. Okay, the first one is I just go to HTTPS localhost. So by the way, you notice this is not secure here. I had to go, just so you know, normally if you go to an insecure endpoint, you end up with a big red thing on your screen in Chrome, and it says, you have to do something. It's a pain in the butt. There is a setting in Chrome. So Chrome local host self sign certificate. There is a button. There's an article. There's a setting called Chrome flags allow insecure local host. You check that on, and now you don't have to do that all that gobbledygook of always hitting like accept. I understand this is a insecure place. Okay, so that's a nice flag. Okay, so the next one is we want to go to /OAuth2, which was the root of it, and then we go to auth. Now, if this works right, so I'm already logged into Salesforce. So let me do this. Developer salesforce.com. So it worked. Well, it's not logged in here. It must have a cookie or something. Okay, so here's how I'm going to test this. Okay, I know what I'm going to do. Because I'm already logged in, it's automatically like, okay, I'm going to copy this. I'm going to do a new incognito window, which has no cache. So this should actually behave the way I'm hoping. Right, there we go. So now, didn't know who I was. So I got redirected to Salesforce. See if I can get this. I can actually have my login. Okay, I provide a username and password. Hit login. It redirects me back to the callback. Oh Lord. Okay, I got a code apparently, which I have to bust out my email. I'm going to use my phone. Of course, my phone has low batteries. One thing after another. Verify your identity. Okay, I got a code. 8. It's a one-time code. 4918. Okay. Whew. And then I'm authorized. So what that did, it came back, gave me the request token. Behind the scenes, my code then went back to sales, got the access token, and stored it all in the Redis. And if you were to go to, and then it also did the synchronize code, which then wrote to the console. It basically got all my contacts out of my Salesforce org and then just dumped them on the screen. So that's why you see all this stuff. And if you were then to go to Redis, just a reminder, if you type in Redis CLI keys star, you can see that I've got my, I've kept the cache of my instance URL, refresh token, and access token. And that lets me like run that job over and over again. Okay, so that's that. Exit. Okay. That's that. The only other thing we can show real quick is CD. See if I can do this. So right now we've showed kind of the code that did the authorization and then the one-time call to synchronize to pull the data down. So let's look at the command line kind of script of basically pulling the data down, because we'll use that in our Heroku Scheduler. But we'll run it first locally first to make sure it works. So the way we can do this is we do documents, Heroku cert. Okay, so then if I got this right, the script is sitting in the dist folder right now, right? And I need to run it, but I just can't run npm run dist because I have to have the environment variable set up right. So, and I thought I had done this a different way before, to be honest, but let me show you how I did it this time. History grep xargs. So, right. So what we're going to use is this command right here. We're going to do cat the environment file, pipe it to xargs, then we're going to export that to, so there's a difference between, setting in variables kind of for the shell, which is like without exporting it, but by using export, it actually makes it available to the full environment. Then once that's done, then I run my node scripts. So I could have swore I did this on an earlier video without having to use export, but it doesn't work. And I don't remember why it worked before and not this time, but this time I have to actually export it locally, right? So if I run this, there it is. And then after 3 seconds, it should exit and then I'm done, right? And that's just basically, just illustrating going to sales, using my keys from Redis, running a call to API to Salesforce, and then just console logging it. Okay, so we have got this fully working locally, right? So the next thing I did was, I'm going to commit all this now. Let me kill off all my local stuff first. So Control C this, exit out of that. And I think I had another one running around the other one. Control C that, exit out of that. Okay, and we're just saying we're almost done. We're just going to prove this all works now inside of Sales on a Heroku. Okay, so to get this to work, I have to commit everything. Git commit minus m. Done this. Okay, let this finish. Done. Okay, and then so I already did this on master, just so you know. But so let me just push this though. Push. I'm going to push this up because this is going to be the code that you can look at it yourself. It's the same thing as master right now. Get push origin sfdc rest. Okay. Right. Okay. So let's let this finish. Okay. Get checkout master. Okay, so master is actually the same status. It's the exact same code I just showed you, and I already pushed this to my. I already did the get push origin master, which then already built the application in my. What did it build? It already built it in my. I'm getting distracted here. Heroku. It built it in my staging app. right? Now, so one thing that I don't really have a good answer for, and I don't think and I'm not going to get into it, but I didn't do a review app in this case. The problem with the review app is the callback URLs, the actual application's name is all based on the PR name, right? It's like something dash PR. And the problem is, in order to make this work, if I really wanted to work with review apps, I would have to push it, have the review app created first, then I had to go into Salesforce again, add that callback URL manually to the list of callbacks, and then I can get it to work as a review app, which seems clumsy to me. So I didn't do all that, but just so you know, you can make this work with review apps, but you have to deal with, I mean, one, you have to do the environment variables, which I didn't even bother doing. And two, you have to then do this clumsy process of kind of, because Salesforce won't allow it to the callback unless it's in its configuration. So just a side note, I only did this on staging and production. And so I've already pushed the code. It's already running here. And so let's just illustrate that it's actually indeed running here. So if I say open app, right? Now just so you know, I'm using free dynos. So they automatically sleep when they're not being used. That's why it took a second to start up, if you're wondering. And if I go to OAuth to auth, I'm probably already authorized, right? So that, because I already have probably a cookie on my machine, it automatically just authorized, right? So that worked. If I look at the output of the log, the paper trail log, I should see that data, right? There's all my data, right? My console log of the Salesforce data. So that's actually all working, right? Another thing we can illustrate is how do I run that command line version. So if I go to here and I type in, let's see if I can get this right. I can run a one-time dyno. So I can do Heroku bash, right? App, A is hello, no, it's Heroku cert Larkin Tucker dash STG. I think that's it, right? So that should log in the remote shell. Oh, what is it? I thought that was it. Heroku. Huh. Okay, well, okay, we'll do it though. We'll go the old-fashioned way of doing this. One Heroku. I thought I had written it down. One off dynos. And so to run a one-off dyno, you run. Oh, you have to do run bash. Okay. Heroku run, because you're running the command, bash on the app. Heroku cert Larkin Tucker. In fact, I don't know how I'm going to do my certification without Google access, to be honest. I barely remember anything. Okay, so what this should open up a bash shell, right? And it's going to have all the environment variables are already set. So my SFDC ones, wherever they're at, should all be here, right? Right? So all that means is I don't have to do that xargs business. So now I should be able to just type in node. See, it's under dist, scripts, synchronize, boom. And if this works, goes to Redis, gets the keys, it then or the tokens, makes the API call, and then exits after 3 seconds. So that's it. Okay, so there's that. The last piece of this, all we have to do is, let's say you wanted to, in fact, we can do everything on now the web page now. Okay, so we're going to look at this Heroku Scheduler business. So let's say I wanted to do that synchronizing the code, which right now just dumps the log every hour, right? So the way you do this, you go to resources, right? And interesting enough, see right here, Heroku Scheduler, right? So you just type in that, you click on this, right? It'll automatically, it's a free service, and right now it looks like it actually uses free dynos, which I was surprised. I thought if you read the docs, it would suggest that you couldn't run free dynos with, because it basically, what Scheduler does, in this case, I've set it for every hour to start. It actually spins up a one-off dyno, and then just like we just did a second ago, right? The bash thing, right? And then it runs that command in that dyno, and then when that exits, it just exits out, right? So if you look at my configuration, though, it does suggest, if I click on it, the way you configure the timing on it is you can log into it, right? And you say add a job, right? And you basically say how often you want it to run, and then you can say what commands you're going to run, right? And it looks like there's an option for free dynos. So jobs within a time window. Yeah, it's not clear. It says it's free dynos. I don't know. I'm not convinced it's free, but you can see mine basically runs every hour at the top of the hour. It runs a free dyno, and it runs this command line, right? And you can see it's going to run next at whatever this is in UTC time, and it last ran then, and next runs this, which is probably in about 15 minutes or so. The last thing is just around this in general. You can see the output of this by looking in your paper trail. And I should see, well, here's my scheduler right here, I bet. That's the web. Okay, so the question is, how do you find your stuff here, right? So I believe you can just search for scheduler. There you go. So it's listed as app scheduler, and it has a job number on it, right? And then you can see basically that it exited fine, and then here's its output. And then you can see it's been running every hour on the hour. So you can get its output and make sure it's actually running. Okay, well that was a lot of materials, but I did get to slip in at least the Heroku Scheduler into this whole mess, and that's about it. Okay, so I think we're done with the video. We're going to switch to another way of interacting with Salesforce that's a lot less code heavy, thank goodness, so we'll look at that one next.